This is going to be a lot of fun, okay? And I have a little presentation to share with you. I love visuals. And we started IEC, Kevin and I. It's an exclusive network. We do monthly events, and it's all about innovation, growth, and impact. For 8 years we've been doing this. We have 170 founders, including Honorable Joe Stapleton, Mayor of Newport Beach. Thank you for coming. See, now, if I was the mayor in the city, I'd be like front row. Humility will take you far. Joe was actually like our second member. Then he brought in Will Tober, and then it grew into this amazing thing. Palmer Luckey was one of our members. Thank you, Jason, for supporting that, and for all the IEC members of being here. And we're really excited to partner with the Pacific Club in doing this. I've been a member of Pacific Club now for 12 years, and it's been invaluable. I'd like to thank Larry Armstrong. Larry was actually the architect of bringing this collaboration together between the Pacific Club and IEC. Because of the content, the people we have access to, and this incredible venue, it was kind of a good joining of forces. So we can mix the members of Pacific Club with the members of IEC, and then bring these like amazing content creators. Palmer, who I hosted here 2 years ago, we filled that room back there with about 250 amazing people. Just as Anduril was hitting that hockey stick growth, we had that amazing conversation about military tech and defense. So that was an honor, and then we subsequently toured Anduril last week, or a couple months ago. Frank Luntz, of course, a great political pollster. He's a contractor of our agency. We've done lots of focus groups with him. He's got like the Smithsonian built in Brentwood. It's his home. Amazing experience for all of us, right at the helm of the whole Biden-Trump, who's going to become president. To hear that from Frank Luntz firsthand for our members was awesome. Next slide. So Farmers and Merchants took us through their bank. So we always meet with the CEOs. You know, it's the top 100 bank in the nation. He's very involved with IEC. He let us each hold $1 million. It's about 16 pounds, just so you know. And then we had Michael Colglazer, who's the CEO of Virgin Galactic, at Palmer Luckey's house. Jason, you helped us bring that huge screen there, and we presented what space travel was like. We had NVIDIA AI lead, as well as founder of Blizzard Entertainment and others. And then just a couple weeks ago, being at Mar-a-Lago, so for my second time in a matter of a month, thanks in part to Type 1 Ventures, Tarek and Abda, if you don't mind raising your hands. These guys are amazing. They're the organizers of this event. They brought 1789, that's Chris Buskert and Don Trump Jr.'s fund, as well as ARK Investments. You probably recognize Kathy Wood. That was a real big moment, because everything happening between now and inauguration date is where everything is happening, okay? Because the concrete starts to harden on the 21st of January, but right now it's soft. So everything happening at Mar-a-Lago is the real deal. Like nations are being defined, okay? Canals are being renamed. Countries are turning into 51st states. And I want to thank Peter Brennan, who's here, who's now been promoted to editor-in-chief of the Orange County Business Journal, for the amazing article that he did on the 20 CEOs from Orange County that went to Mar-a-Lago. And we're sitting right in front of David Sachs and Kathy Woods talking about industry and about compliance and about regulations and about things. And this is something that would not happen under another administration. So that's what happened. So what are the key takeaways from Mar-a-Lago that I'm sharing with you firsthand? This is really important, are the 5 big growth sectors, okay? AI, we know that. David Sachs, we have direct texting with the guy, okay? So hopefully we bring him to Orange County soon. Energy, big reason why we're here today. Nuclear, storage, alternative energies. Robotics, so you're gonna see a lot of robotics, and it's not just Elon Musk's like butler. I'm talking about robotics in manufacturing and virtually every industry. Blockchain, cryptocurrency, Kevin Maloney, my partner. Thank you for coming. And genomics, so advancing healthcare through genome editing and other things, which leads us into our next speaker, Jin Lee, who will be here next month, Stanford Neurosciences AI. So we're very excited to have her. A crypto regulation is one of the things that David Sachs is going to be frameworking, which I think will give stronger performance in the crypto market, so keep an eye on that. And Kathy Wood predicted AI, blockchain, and life sciences could boost GDP growth 10% by 2040, driven by good deflation. And she's remarkable. She's created a multi-billion-dollar fund, and I really, really believe in the outcomes that she's created. And her S-curve synergy, which is innovations in one area accelerate the others. It's pretty amazing. Like that right there, if you can master that, you're going to do incredibly well in whatever industry you're in. And then the future growth sectors, which we define there. So IEC has a member app, so think of a private LinkedIn where we have access to like your birthday and your cell number and the stuff you wouldn't put out into the public, and that's very helpful. And then benefits to all. So like you join IEC, you get out to the world, but you stay private and you come to these sort of events. And I always have to ask Palmer, I'm like, dude, can we do like one more event with Chili Willy's, you know? So, it's January, so I'm not serving alcohol this month. We're gonna serve Coke and Diet Coke and like water, okay? Like we're gonna really keep you guys sober, but we're gonna sugar you up, okay? So we have our beef jerky. It's the best beef jerky, family's best beef jerky. We have Pacific Club cookies. We cut them in half. So if you want peanut butter and chocolate chip, you could have one of both, okay? But you don't have to have the whole cookie. And then we have Palmer's Chili Willy's that are gonna come out of dry ice at the end of this event. So you have something to look forward to in case you fall asleep, okay? And Jin Lee, I mentioned, she's here. She flew in from Korea, then Palo Alto, and came here. She has an amazing science lab at Stanford. I was honored to tour it. I thought it was like a lab. She's like, no, this whole floor is mine. It's amazing. If you guys are ever up in Palo Alto, you have to meet up with Jin. She has an incredible neurological AI company that creates a digital twin of the brain and can predict neurological disorder and connect that to drug discovery. So she's going to be unpacking that for us next month. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Isaiah to all of you. I met Isaiah originally through Tom Sauer, who's an IEC member. Unfortunately, he has something he's dealing with today, but I wish he was here because he's the reason why all of us are here, in a way. So I met Isaiah when we did a fundraiser for Blake Masters when he was running for Senate. And it was a remarkable moment because I'm like, wait, he's doing nuclear and he's in his 20s? Like, I want to know more. And we built this contact, and then subsequently I ran into him at the lunch at Mar-a-Lago, and he's been a regular there, a little bit more than me. I'm a little bit envious, but that's okay. Yeah, I'm just in PR. Like, who wants a PR guy? They want like a nuclear guy, right? So we got Isaiah to come out here today. So if you guys could all put your hands together and introduce Isaiah to the stage. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah, thank you.
So I know there's a couple slides there, and once you want to advance, just tell Tion, he'll do that for you. So obviously I know you, Isaiah. We got to connect a couple times, and you got an incredible story. You're taking on like a huge challenge. Maybe you could just give a little background to everyone, like where you grew up and like what your background is, and then we can kind of go into Valar.
Yeah, I think the story starts a lot before I was born, actually. My great-grandfather was a nuclear physicist on the Manhattan Project. He was recruited out of the University of Chicago when he was 24, was married 6 months before, and so moved with my great-grandmother to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The secret city, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers just appeared in the woods in Tennessee in 1942. And that kind of set the trajectory for my life, long before I was born. But I grew up hearing stories of that around the breakfast table. Some of my most prized possessions are, I had an Apple Watch. My great-grandmother only died actually a couple years ago. And I would sit at the breakfast table and I would ask her questions about the Manhattan Project. They both worked on it actually, and that's one of the most precious things that I have is listening to her talk about the secrecy and the mission that they're working on. And for a long time, growing up, I grew up around rural Kentucky and a few other places around the Midwest, and was always thinking about this and reading about it. And by the time I was probably 10 or so, I'd read every book I could possibly find on any shelf about nuclear reactors and how they worked. But at some point, I discovered that the industry itself was broken, that the technology was amazing, the technology works perfectly, and the industry was broken, and the policy was broken. And so basically since I've been 12 really, amongst doing other things in engineering, I was sort of in the background trying to solve this problem of how do you actually fix nuclear? How do you truly scale it to a civilizational level technology? And about a year and a half ago, I kind of reached that point of okay, I think I know how to fix it, and started Valar Atomics. So.
And so what was that tipping point of I figured it out? What was that spark?
Yeah. It was actually one particular evening that I was researching a few different things and kind of had that spark and chased it in an insane 3-day all-nighter, which my wife was extremely kind to basically continuously bring me food and hope I was okay as wrote and Googled all night long. But essentially, I had already decided since I was like 16 or 17 that the essential problem with nuclear is that it's a complex system. So the technology is complex, but it's also socially complex. So it's got these like two dimensions of complexity. It's dangerous, people worry about it. And so you have these like overlapping complexities. And when you have a very complex technology, the way that you fix that is scale, right? Complex technologies need scale to work well. And there's this built-in problem with nuclear that prevents us from ever getting to scale. And that problem is the grid. So the grid is a very non-scalable piece of old technology, actually. Like most of our grid exists from like before 1950. And the problem is you have this like terrible, all of business is actually distribution, right? All technologists are actually in the distribution business if they become very successful. And nuclear is default constrained with this old piece of technology called the grid. And so if you really want to scale nuclear, this is sort of my conviction from when I was in high school. I knew that we would have to figure out how to scale it beyond the grid. We'd have to figure out how to do better than the grid for distribution. But I didn't know exactly how to do that, and went through, I would say, 7 different iterations of what Valar was on paper, all trying to get to that solution of how do we scale nuclear in a way that overcomes the distribution limitations of the grid. The first thing that I wanted to do was actually build nuclear reactors on barges and like float them out on the water, because then you could have like many floating barges and you could stretch cables from onshore grids out onto the water. It doesn't really work. It's like kind of a good idea. There's a couple people trying to do that. I don't think it's going to work that well. Russia did it, but they can do it with state resources. And went through a lot of different iterations, but that kind of eureka moment was pretty interesting. I realized that chemical energy doesn't have the same constraints as electricity. It's actually much easier to move an energetic chemical around than to move electrons around. And the reason for that is you can put chemicals into a bucket, and you can carry the bucket around. You can put the bucket on a train or on a truck, on an airplane. And I thought that chemical was hydrogen for a while. So I was researching hydrogen. The idea is, okay, let's scale nuclear and produce tons and tons of hydrogen, right? This allows us to get out of the grid as far as your distribution goes. The problem with hydrogen is it's also not very scalable. It's also not very distributable. And so I was looking for ways to essentially, mass scale distribution of hydrogen. And I was looking at actually the particular moment when I think Valar Atomics really started was looking at a picture of an LNG tanker. And I was trying to figure out, could we use nat gas infrastructure to transport hydrogen? Could we put liquid hydrogen into an LNG tanker? Can we use that? And I was trying to think, could you retrofit this to be, negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit so that you actually have liquid hydrogen, and like all these different questions. And I was looking at it and I suddenly realized, actually that is already a liquid hydrogen tanker. And the reason is because it's carrying methane, right? So methane, natural gas, is CH4, right? So it's 1 carbon and it's 4 hydrogens. So actually 80% of the atoms on that ship are already hydrogen in liquid form. And the carbon there is actually the key. Carbon makes hydrogen an actually usable fuel. And we call that a hydrocarbon. And it's what our energy world is already built on today, right? So it turns out that when we talk about chemical energy distribution, hydrocarbons are already the right thing. So this moment was basically okay, could we just make hydrocarbons? Could you have a nuclear reactor that produces hydrogen, and could we bond that hydrogen with CO2 and actually just make a liquid fuel? And it turns out the answer is yes.
And so you also mentioned a social component. Is that because the word nuclear is so sensitive from a societal standpoint? And talk a little bit about that dynamic a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I mean, over the last decade or so, nuclear really didn't have a moment until I would say 8 months ago. We're just now, I didn't even know that the moment was going to come back. I kind of started this company imagining that we were going to be fighting insane PR battles constantly and finding random far-off places of the world to deploy these reactors. And it's only been the last 6 to 8 months or so that there's sort of been a reawakening or a moment. But yeah, it's a socially complex technology because of a few things. A lot of misinformation is one. People imagine that the nuclear accidents that have happened so far are worse than they are. 43 people died in Chernobyl. And even though that's a terrible tragedy, that 43-person death count makes it the safest form of energy generation humanity has ever seen. Because if you take all other energy formats, natural gas, coal, even solar, by the way, all of them have higher death counts. How do people die from solar? Well, mining...
Wait, let me guess. Is it like the ant on the magnifying glass?
That's right. You stand in the right spot where it's all reflecting, and you're just no. No, but mining for solar panel resources kills more people per power output than has ever died from a nuclear reactor. So the problem with nuclear is that it creates these like big flashy moments. 3 Mile Island, 3 Mile Island is a good example of that. Nobody died in 3 Mile Island, and yet it essentially shuttered the nuclear industry in the U.S. for 20 years. Fukushima is another example. People imagine that this was this horrible thing. Nobody died in Fukushima. And thankfully, Japan was able to sort of come back from that and is now building new reactors, which is fantastic. But yeah, it has this publicity issue. And so this was part of my thinking in the business model, which is that you need to find a way to build nuclear which doesn't require you to continuously go to a new city and walk into that city and say, I want to put a reactor in your backyard. Right? Mr. Mayor asked me earlier, hey, can we have a reactor in Newport Beach? And as much as I would love to put a reactor here, actually the better thing to do is to put a bunch of reactors out in the desert, make hydrocarbons and distribute the hydrocarbons. Because you have one place that produces a lot of power, and you don't have to worry every single city that like there's a reactor right next door. So that's definitely part of the business model.
So a year and a half ago, you come up with this business, and you're going up against almost impossible odds to bring this to market. Tell us how you were able to take that to investors and actually get a seed and to turn this into a business. And I'm going to have Tion take us to the next slide, which has a couple photos of your factory. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah, wait 30 seconds and I'll flag it. So this is like an interesting thing in nuclear. You're right, it's a monumental challenge. And I started, literally like just me. I'm a software engineer. I actually dropped out of high school. I never finished high school. I didn't finish college. The reason for that actually is that I got a very good job offer when I was a 16-year-old to do software engineering for the DoD. Taught myself to code in middle school, but had no real startup experience. I thought I was a pretty decent engineer, but that was about it. And it kind of just walked into it and said, like, all right, let's make something happen here. I wrote about a 200-page memo on why I thought this was going to work, and pitched 85 different venture capital firms around the country. I got 84 no's and 1 yes, and that 1 yes was a $1.5 million check from Riot Ventures up in Los Angeles. Really great crew over there, Steve Marcus, now on my board. But yeah, it was a brutal process. Frankly, I'd never raised venture capital before, and didn't know anything about it. But specifically went into it saying, I'm going to go raise the money myself, and then I'm going to go find the best team in the world in nuclear, and I'm going to walk up to them already having money in the bank. Right? I specifically didn't want co-founders. I wanted to be able to go to the best people in the world who were the most talented people in the world and say, I have the money already. Come join me. I'll pay you. And that's what we did. Tell
me a little bit about that entrepreneurial like persistence and passion. Like where did that come? Where you're like at firm number 80 and you're just like another door shut. And how did you survive that darkness and come out of it and lock up 85?
Yeah, it was it was brutal. We didn't expect it to take as long as it did or go through as many firms as we did because, and I say we, I'm really talking about like myself and a couple friends that I was like texting through the process, but I've seen like ridiculous things get funded all the time, and so I was like, well, this is a great idea. Of course, it's going to get funded, but really, I just didn't have any networking. I literally knew a single venture capitalist who lived up in the woods in Wyoming because I was living in North Idaho, and she wrote me a $25,000 check, and an amazing person, but. Yeah, so it took forever, but I just didn't feel like there was any other choice. I knew how to fix the problem, and I know that if and when I'm able to actually build this, it will be $1 trillion company. So there's no other choice.
And so now you're a business, and now you got number 85.
Yes.
And then you're now sitting at Mar-a-Lago, where the President of the United States is roaming around, and you're being invited over and over again to be part of very compelling conversations that are leading energy discussions. AI is almost like the Atkins diet. Like it's a fad. It's very interesting. Everyone is on it. But I think the byproduct of it is the energy.
Yeah.
And there's limitations to energy. And this is what Kathy and Sachs and everyone's concerned about. Why is the United States so slow to adopting nuclear as opposed to other countries like China, where reactors are being launched every day? Is that due to the government structure, or is it technology advancements? Maybe you could shed some light on that.
It's entirely regulatory. We've built a very, very broken regulatory environment in the U.S., and it's truly the reason that we haven't been able to build with anywhere near the speed that the Chinese or the Russians have. The Russians are turning on an advanced reactor next year, which is absolutely state of the art. So that's why I'm at Mar-a-Lago. Really, I'm advocating for regulatory change, which will allow us to build again, and very surprised and happy to hear, receptive, to find receptive people there.
Yeah, and I know Elon retweeted you today, and a lot of the right people are keeping an eye on you and investing in you. That being said, talk to us a little bit about the regulatory environment under the new admin. Do you see a shift in a way that's going to be pro-nuclear to where you could advance into commercial applications?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a 4-year window here that's highly leveraged. I mean, I'm kind of telling everybody in my circles of entrepreneurs, like, all of the places that we've gotten stuck in the last 20 or 30 years, we have a 4-year window to fix it. So, like, work as hard as imaginable over the next 4-year period to do that. There are a couple very key things that this is the drum that I'm beating at Mar-a-Lago, and I'll beat it for you here. There are a couple of things that the Trump administration could do on day one to fix nuclear energy. The first one is that they could settle Texas versus the NRC. So there's a lawsuit called Texas versus the NRC filed by a friend of mine that we've been talking about for a few years. And this lawsuit essentially challenges the jurisdiction of the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The NRC was created in 1954 to regulate very large-scale nuclear that is critical to national security, right? So Congress wanted to make sure that the weapons program had enough uranium supply, and that extremely large reactors near large cities or near commerce centers were federally regulated. They did not intend the NRC to regulate literally every single atom-splitting device on U.S. soil. And in fact, the NRC not only has broken that rule, that they were given in the Atomic Energy Act and claimed jurisdiction on literally everything that splits atoms on U.S. soil, they've also decided that they have jurisdiction over the actions of U.S. citizens off of U.S. soil, which is a wild breach of the Constitution that no other agency has gone as far as to say, if I am, in a desert island or I'm Antarctica or something like that, that the NRC, regulates my actions in the criminal court, actually. And so it's a wild overreach of federal bureaucracy. So that's the first thing that the Trump administration could do, is just direct the DOJ to settle that lawsuit. And that would force the NRC to rewrite the rule and carve back the jurisdiction to where the law is written. That's the first thing. The second thing is the way that technology really iterates, moves forward rather, is through iteration. Right? The only way that technology actually advances is by building something, testing it, and building another thing. Right? This is what we've seen with SpaceX. We had this old, stuck space industry. Russia was well beyond us. We were starting to have to take astronauts to the International Space Station on Russian ships. And the way that Elon Musk fixed that was not by designing the perfect rocket. Can I swear here a little bit?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. It was by designing a shitty rocket and testing it, and then making it slightly better, and then testing it and making it better and testing it. And in fact, to begin that process, he had to go off of U.S. soil. It's a very similar setup. He could not get permission from the FAA to launch Falcon 1. So what he did is he went to the South Pacific. He went to Kwajalein Island in the South Pacific, and he shipped his team out there for 6 months, and Falcon 1 and launched it there. And that was, what enabled them to bring it back to Santa Barbara and actually launch the next version and eventually get to Falcon 9. But few people realize that Falcon 1 was not a good rocket. It's not actually something that you would want to build many of. It was too expensive. It was slow. But technology moves forward through building, testing, building, testing. And that's exactly what we need to do in nuclear. And I would say that the growth rate of a technology company, a deep tech company, right, a company whose main advantage is the depth of their technology, their value is basically set by their growth rate. And their growth rate is set by how quickly they can iterate. And in software, the reason that you have these like incredibly inflected software companies is that the iteration rate in software is a couple seconds, right? When you're writing software, you write a line of code, you hit play, you see what happened in a couple seconds. You see you made a mistake, you fix it, a couple seconds, right? And there's this rapid iteration to the product you want. And in the space industry, it's like 6 months, right? They could launch Starship prototypes every 6 months. In nuclear, with the regulatory environment we have, it's about 7 years. It's 7 years between any test, right? Just to get the NRC to say, with a tiny device that would fit inside this room and is extremely safe, and is completely passively safe, and has a massive concrete dome around it, 7 years to flip the switch and test it. That has to change. Right. We have to change that if we want to beat China.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that. What the Trump administration could do on day one to fix that is that the Department of Energy has congressional authority today to regulate test reactors, and it's a political agency, right? So it's not an independent agency. It's a political agency, which means that Trump could direct Chris Wright, the incoming director of the DOE, to create what I'm calling the test reactor board, which would be a board of 30 physicists and engineers who have 90 days to approve or reject with cause a test reactor. So if Valar Atomics goes to them and say, hey, we've got this big land out in the middle of the desert, we've built a very large concrete dome around it, it's completely safe, that this board has 90 days to approve or reject with cause this test reactor. So that's something, two things that they could do in day one to rapidly accelerate our progress.
And it almost sounds like you're reading the mission statement of Doge.
I hope so. I mean, I think that everyone that I've been happily surprised. I thought that there would be a million priorities going on, and there are, but I think everybody understands that energy is crucial to many of the things that we're trying to do over the next 4 years.
So let's talk about application. So where do you apply a modular nuclear reactor? Yeah. Who's your customer? Yeah. Is it data centers? Tell me how China's using it. Can you go into how this would actually be used?
So our competency is making lots of nuclear reactors which make really cheap energy. And then we build sort of a portfolio of products on top of that. And the short answer is whoever wants to buy it at the right price, at the right volume. Data centers, I think, are number one today just because there's this massive lack of supply for data center power. They also, they're just buying it at an enormous premium as well. So you can make a lot of money on that. I think long term, we're really interested in replacing fuel supply. We think that we're very long hydrocarbons. We think that oil and gas is going to be here for not just the next 50 years, but the next 200, 300, 400 years. I gave a talk at USC a couple weeks ago about how hydrocarbons are actually the perfect theoretical fuel. We can talk about that, but yeah, we eventually, eventually is in 8, 9 years from now, after we've served our first set of premium data center customers. We think we can just make the world's jet fuel and diesel and gasoline, and you get into these massive, massive markets.
Absolutely. And so the name Valar, yes. Valar Atomics, can you tell us a little bit about the history there?
Yeah, so the Valar, this is a Lord of the Rings reference. I was not copying Palmer, I promise.
There's a similar.
I told Palmer I was not copying him. I have been reading Lord of the Rings since I was very young, and I always wanted to name the company this. And the reason is the Valar are these, they're sort of the spirits behind everything in Middle-earth. So, you don't see them necessarily, but they're causing everything to happen, in the water, in the air, and different things. And I think that's how energy is as well. Energy is sort of the industry behind the industry. If you want to know, why does China have a metals industry and we don't? Why did we lose steel? Why don't we make aluminum? Why don't we have gallium? Why don't we have germanium? The answer is energy. And it's kind of hard to see that at first, but literally the reason that we are having this massive metals dependency in the chip industry is because China burns very cheap coal. So they have 3 cents a kilowatt hour industrial electricity, and bauxite has to be electrolyzed to make aluminum, and gallium and germanium are byproducts of bauxite electrolysis. And that's it. That's why they dominate 99% of the world's gallium supply. And so energy is just one of these things. It's like it's behind everything, it's underneath everything. You don't notice it, but it's very, very determinate to what your economy looks like.
And for our audience, can you share with us the images on the screen about your factory and facility? A lot of people are like, what does a nuclear reactor look like? And I think these application photos are telling.
So one of the things that I want you to notice here as we're building this, actually, let's go to the next one first. What do you, here's Max, by the way, looking like a total cheese, putting his thumb up next to our reactor cap. Where's Max? There he's in the back here.
Max, by the way, now works with Valar, who
yes.
Is a local here in Orange County.
Yes, Max is working for me, bringing the team spirit. What I want you to notice about these photos, this is our thermal test unit. So we're basically building this reactor. It's a one-to-one nuclear reactor. You could literally put uranium in it and turn it on. We won't put uranium in it because it's illegal to, right? Like we talked about. And so what we do is we do everything except put uranium in it. I actually go back one more. You see these vertical rods in the far right photo. Those are pure silicon carbide rods. Silicon carbide melts at about 2,500 degrees Celsius, and it's an electrical conductor. So what that means is that we can put a very large amount of voltage through those, and we can actually mimic the heat of a nuclear core. So that's essentially like our fake nuclear fuel that we use to mimic the system one-to-one. Go ahead and go to the next one again. But what I wanted you to notice about this is like, is this what you thought building a nuclear reactor would look like? It's a lot like dirtier than you'd think, and a lot more like real, and there's like piles of metal nearby. And it turns out that like the way that heavy industry works is very hands-on, and it's not actually supposed to be like years and years of paperwork and tons of process to test something. It's supposed to be fast, it's supposed to be quick and dirty, and you test something, you see how it worked, then you move to increasing levels of sophistication. This is very much a part of our DNA. The normal track for a nuclear company is to spend 2 or 3 years in what you call conceptual design. Then you spend maybe 2 years in engineering. So that means like take a conceptual design into a fully engineered thing. You have CAD for every part. You have a procurement plan for every part. Then you spend maybe 2 years building this non-nuclear prototype. So you're like 7 years in and like, okay, now we have a nuclear prototype. When I put this team together, every person that I interviewed on the nuclear team, I told you this at lunch, but I asked one question, which was, if I gave you a desert island and the R&D facility of SpaceX and the graduating class of USC, how long would it take you to turn on a nuclear reactor? And if anyone said longer than a year, I ended the conversation. Because it actually doesn't take longer than a year to build a nuclear reactor. The world's first nuclear reactor was built in 8 months in Chicago, where my great-grandfather worked. And we've actually gotten slower at building reactors. So we're very much a return to where nuclear started. This is actually a pretty similar concept to some of the earliest nuclear reactors. It's very safe. It's not as sexy as some of the reactor concepts out there, but it's extremely simple and extremely safe. And we think that's vital to getting into these like rapid iterations. So to benchmark Valar against what I told you about, this sort of like 7-year timeline, when I got the team together, I told them, we're going to try to split the atom in 18 months. Since the first reactor in 8 months, that would break a world record. The world record since that first one is 2 years and 6 months. And so I got this team together about 8 months ago. We spent 2 months instead of 2 years in conceptual design. We spent 4 months instead of 2 years in engineering. And we are almost done with fabrication. This is going to be complete in about 18 days, Lord willing. And so, that would put us at about 1 year and 2 months from the founding of the company to a non-nuclear prototype standing there being tested and working.
So before I turn it out to all of you for Q&A, maybe you can just talk a little bit about the current challenges of the industry. I'd also like to know what differentiates Valar from any other nuclear startup.
Yeah, the challenge of the industry is entirely regulatory. I'll start off with, it's essentially illegal to build nuclear reactors. And to do that at any meaningfully cost-effective way is essentially illegal in wildly irrational ways, by the way. We're not talking about regulations that make things safe. We're talking about wild irrationalities. And the reason is because there's just this monolithic monopolistic NRC sitting on top of everything, which is answerable to nobody. It's an independent agency. They're answerable to no one.
Isn't it answering to other energy source lobbyists, maybe?
Oh yeah, no, they're perfect, and there's no special interest involved at all. No, so like that is the big problem. Now, to solve this initially, like my long-term plan is that I want to help the United States become a good regulatory environment. That's why I'm spending so much time in Mar-a-Lago. But we don't want to gate on that. So the first thing that we do is we're going to turn the first reactor on outside the country. The country we have an agreement with is going to be announced in about a month from now. But we have a binding contract with the nuclear regulator of another country who basically agreed to our timeline. Then we're like, hey, we're going to take it to this country. They say they're game. They're in an energy crisis. They really need it. They're a U.S. ally. Let's go. And a lot of investors were like, oh, if it's not in the U.S., it's not like, what are you doing? It's not the real deal. And my answer to that is like, well, this is what Elon had to do. Elon had to take Falcon 1 to Quad and launch it because you have to move forward. So,
yeah. And maybe just take me through monetization. Like, how does Valar make money?
Yes.
When the product's in market, and how do you charge, sort of thing?
Yeah. So we have these, our business model is called a gigasite. A gigasite is somewhere where we pick a very ideal piece of land and we build many, many reactors there, right? We get these like large scale sites. We get to be a lot cheaper because we get scale. And then what we do is we take customers on that gigasite campus. So you can kind of think of it as like an energy campus. So these are data centers, aluminum smelters, green steel, lots of energy intense industry. And we essentially just sell energy onto a private microgrid to those customers. And then in the, I would say 6 or 7 year timeline, we begin to start making our own hydrocarbon fuels at a significant discount to oil and gas. We think we can beat oil and gas on price, and then the sky's the limit.
Awesome. Well, continued success. I mean, 25 years old. I can't wait to show my son this video and be like, aspiration, son. He's gonna be like, oh, I can not go to high school anymore? With that said, I'd like to really just turn it out to you for maybe like 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A with Isaiah. Why don't we start with Larry Armstrong?
Well, first of all, thanks for your presentation. It's amazing and inspiring.
Thank you.
Talk about your competition a little bit. I imagine I've heard for years about new modular nuclear units being developed.
Yeah.
By maybe some traditional companies. So talk about that maybe a little bit.
Yeah, so first off, I would say like in the market, competition for nuclear is almost a meaningless concept. It's such a gigantic market that nobody who's building a nuclear reactor and doing it well today is truly my competition in that sense. There's so much demand, we can't possibly fill all of it. That said, there's sort of like a jockeying for position and like who gets the VC dollars and who gets the talent and these sorts of things. So there's a bit of competition. As far as that, I would just say like the most important thing in a deep tech company is speed. How fast do you get through those iterations? How fast can you build something, test it, build another thing, test it? That really is the growth rate of your company. And the reason is because nuclear is not a technology, it's a property of physics, right? The fact that the atom splits and it makes energy is a property of physics. And technology, building nuclear reactors is sort of like chasing that theoretical infinite ideal. And if you get anywhere close to that target, you are making energy cheaper than we've ever seen on Earth. And energy is in $4 trillion demand, right? So that iteration rate, I would say, is your scorecard. Once we have this thermal reference plant turned on, I would say we'll be ahead of the competition by about 4x the nearest competitor. So the next nearest competitor took 4 years to turn on their thermal prototype from founding, and that's fast, right? And we'll be 1 year. So I would say that's where we are benchmark-wise.
Next question, Jin Lee.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Compared to building a traditional nuclear power plant
Yeah.
and to oil and gas, how much saving in cost are you expecting?
So we will hopefully be about 22 times cheaper than existing nuclear, which sounds like a crazy number, except it's really about where we were in 1977. So in 1977, we were about 22 times cheaper than we are now at building a new nuclear power plant.
Not in terms of building the power plant,
Okay.
but from the consumer point of view.
Sure, yeah.
How much will I pay less?
Yeah, so there's like this balance between how much cheaper you get it and how much you scale. I would say our goal initially is to be a little bit cheaper than the market and to do a ton of it, right? So like build many, many reactors. We won't really optimize the design of the reactor that much, at the beginning, as long as we're cheaper, and scale the business out. So I don't think Valar creates consumer surplus, essentially is what you're asking, for at least like 5 to 10 years, frankly, because there's just so much market share to grab first. Does that kind of make sense?
But by consumer, I don't mean individual.
Yeah.
Like if I'm a data center owner.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is like I will capture the premiums, and I want the premiums, right? So like Microsoft is paying $150 a megawatt hour to turn on 3 Mile Island right now. Wild premium, because they just have to have data centers. My price is going to be $149, right? Because I want the margin.
Microsoft just
right?
committed tens of billions of dollars into new data centers, which was
Right.
public information last week.
So
timing's pretty good.
now, what will our internal costs be? We think that we'll probably be 70% better off the bat than anyone selling traditional nuclear today. But price-wise, like we'll eat the margin. Dimitri.
How's it going?
Good to see you.
So is the idea, obviously at scale, to create kind of microgrids across the United States of these mini reactors?
I would say the goal in the United States is to create several, like 3 or 4, very large power campuses. So we're in talks with a couple of different states today to create the first gigasite, and this is sort of like this is where I think nuclear has to be reborn. It has to be reborn on these very large-scale power campuses where we have the ability to iterate and have the ability to scale. From there, I think we will see, nuclear get safer and mass-produced and publicly accepted, and you'll begin to see nuclear spread out a little bit. But our plan to begin with is like 3 or 4 very large-scale gigasites.
Is there any difference between, there's a difference, but is there conceptually a difference between this large-scale power site and just a large nuclear reactor?
Yes, our power sites are like hundreds of small reactors rather than one very large reactor. And that allows us to, so a gigasite is really a co-location of a SMR factory and an SMR deployment site. So we build the reactor, we ship it 40 feet across the fence and plug it in.
Jason.
In other presentations about nuclear, I've heard them talk about using some of the spent waste from the old-fashioned reactors.
Yep.
Is your system able to do that, and what kind of waste do you generate?
Yeah, so we are pretty much in line with existing normal nuclear reactors. We use low-enriched uranium. We'll produce low-level radioactive waste, the same as a normal nuclear power plant does. I think the type of reactor you're talking about is a fast reactor. A fast spectrum reactor basically turns the wasted fuel into more fuel, plutonium-239 or uranium-233. And that's an extremely compelling concept. The reactor I was talking about in Russia that's turning on next year is exactly that type. I would love to be building reactors like that, but we need to start very simple, very safe, and get more sophisticated over time. This is really a Toyota Camry, right? We're building a Toyota Camry, and you're talking about it like a McLaren. And like I would love to build the McLarens, but first we master the Camry.
And Toyota, of all companies, is moving hydrogen, so yeah.
They are. Maybe I'll get them to go back to hydrocarbons, though. Hydrocarbons rock.
Probably. Yeah, sir.
Hi, I'm Leo. Thanks for your presentation.
Absolutely.
My question is related to the reactor campus.
Yeah.
You mentioned. First one is the batteries, commercial grade battery storage is commercial need.
Is what?
Texas and many deserted area and close to grid. Well, your campus has to be similar situation, like close to the grid, or do you need the battery storage for
We can genuinely be like in the middle of nowhere, which is really like the regulatory benefit and this like public benefit, right? It's like that we can go out in the middle of the desert. That means that the grid is not our primary customer. As far as data centers go, data centers want a couple nines of uptime, and so yeah, we have for sure battery storage to protect those nines of uptime, but nothing like grid scale storage, right? It's like data center scale storage. Yeah.
And also related to that, replication purpose, does each site, each campus needs a standalone, a full kind of survey, safety, regulation, and checkout assessments, or it can be like once it's done, it's like ready to assemble to be deployed in each different site. I guess that will affect the time frame you need for the replication.
That's a really good question. So the first thing you said was correct. We will use the normal regulatory framework, which is really built for power stations. Like the current regulatory framework for nuclear is like building power stations for the grid. We'll use that, but we'll basically just make it a very large bucket. We'll go to the nuclear regulators and say, we would like a 100 reactor power station. This is something they've thought about before. It's not going to be out of the blue for them. But we essentially get to use that permit 100 times right on that site. Now, if we want a new gigasite, yes, we have to go through that process again to get permitted for a new site. But if you do the math on that, it's about 100 times less nuclear permitting than a traditional nuclear company.
Kevin Maloney, whose company probably needs a lot of energy, or the cryptocurrency / Bitcoin world, you have a question.
I had a question on just the thermomechanics part of it. How do you prevent thermal runaway? Do you need to be adjacent to a body of water or running water?
Great question. So I'll answer the question in two parts. Should I talk about nuclear physics? Is that fun here? No? Okay. All right, let me explain why nuclear reactors blow up. So nuclear reactions, there's basically uranium atoms, and if one of them splits, it produces 2 neutrons. And one of the neutrons will hopefully hit another uranium atom, which will cause it to split, and it creates 2 neutrons, and that's exponential growth, right? You have 1 hitting 2, creating 4, creating 8, right? So that's the principle of nuclear. Now, what I just said was actually not true. When the neutron leaves the first uranium atom, it's actually going too fast to cause more fission. Okay, so you actually have to slow the neutron down before it contacts another uranium atom in order to cause another fission event. And the way that we slow it down is we basically bump it into a bunch of other smaller atoms first, which slows it down, and then you can contact another uranium. That substance is called a moderator. So a moderator is a substance that kind of sits in between the nuclear fuel, slows the neutrons down so that they can cause more fission. The traditional moderator in a nuclear reactor is water. So when we talk about a light water reactor or a pressurized water reactor, the function of the water in there is twofold. One is to remove the heat so that it's useful. The other is to moderate the neutrons because hydrogen is a very effective neutron moderator. Now, there's a basic safety problem in that because while water is a very effective neutron moderator, it also wants to be steam when it gets hot. Right, and the whole point of a nuclear reactor is to get hot. And in fact, most light water reactors operate well above the boiling point of water, and so they're hyper-pressurized to maintain water as a liquid. So there's sort of this default problem built into traditional nuclear design, which is like the water needs to be hot so it's efficient, but it really, really wants to be steam. And when it becomes steam accidentally, there's this 1500x pressure spike. It's not linear, right? It goes from 1x pressure to 1500x pressure when it becomes steam. So that's the sort of basic safety issue with nuclear. We completely circumvent that entirely. We don't use any water. We don't use water to moderate our neutrons. This is a design that was actually one of the earliest nuclear designs, and we moved away from it for various reasons, mostly military reasons. We use carbon. So we use graphite as the moderator. Graphite starts as a solid in our reactor and stays a solid. It never changes phase. And what's interesting is moderators, and this is the key safety point, if you're ever evaluating a nuclear reactor, ask about exactly what you asked, thermal runaway. It turns out that moderators are temperature dependent, meaning as they heat up, they become less and less effective as moderators. And what that means is if your reactor gets hotter and hotter and you start to have thermal runaway, if your moderator is designed correctly, it'll actually shut down the reaction. It'll just stop because it ceases to slow down those neutrons. For carbon, graphite, that's about 1,000 degrees Celsius where the moderation effect ceases, and it melts at 2,500 C. Right, so the melting point of carbon is way above the temperature at which it fails to moderate neutrons. What that means it's literally a meltdown-proof reactor, completely passively safe. This was the principle of high-temperature gas reactor designs for a long time. But 3 months ago, China actually just did this for the first time in this reactor that my team designed. They had an operating reactor. They were running it at temperature, and they decided to just turn the power off to the facility and see what happened. And they turned the power off. The temperature rose to about 1,050 degrees. The moderator failed to moderate the neutrons, and it shut down. So I think this is definitely the safest type of reactor, and all reactors should be built this way for a while.
So you could take it to arid environments, not rely on water, and produce things like NH3,
Yes.
ammonia, which is one of the most critical chemicals on the planet, which is used for bombs and missiles, but mostly for fertilizer.
That's right.
You literally could end world hunger with these anyway. And that's a $1 trillion business also.
Yes, ammonia is another one like nat gas. We do think about ammonia a lot. We don't talk about it as much because it's easier to talk about jet fuel and people know more about that market. But yes, that's correct. Yeah.
2 more questions. We'll go Jason and then MC. Oh, and Talbot, of course. And then 3 more, and that's it.
Thank you. Hi. So, I'm not a chemist, so pardon the ignorance if
Yep.
I ask a stupid question. But where does I'm wondering oil companies need to drill for oil.
Yep, and we don't. How does that work?
So in other words, where does
Yeah.
the essence of your whole business come from?
Yes.
The uranium.
Okay.
How much supply is there? And the sun will be here for 5 billion years. So it's like we have 5 billion years of supply of that.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And then is there any talk of vertical integration where do you drill for the uranium, so
Yep.
to speak?
This is a really good question. I was debating with Palmer about this a couple weeks ago at an event that we did in Anduril. The short answer is the Earth has 40 billion years of uranium. Of uranium and thorium. So there's 2 major fissile isotopes in Earth's crust, and we have 40 billion years of it. So when you hear people say, oh, we have 200 years worth of uranium left, or oh, there's only 500 years worth of uranium, this is just one of these ridiculous things that people say all the time about many elements. You'll hear there's only 200 years of copper. It's yeah, but that's because the reason that copper exploration companies explore for copper is when the number goes below 200. And then they explore a little bit more, and then they stop exploring, right? So it's there's actually plenty of uranium. We just don't bother exploring for more of it when we have plenty of it. So we have plenty of uranium. There's tons of uranium in Georgia. Most of the uranium in the world right now comes from Kazakhstan. That's mostly just because of our EPA, like many things. So there's lots of uranium. That's not mining the uranium, though. We'll still purchase uranium ore from existing sources.
MC?
Yes, I'm going to bring it back to Sinan's comments to begin with, where he mentioned Cathy Wood's S-curve, right? Various industries that together will
Yes.
propel everything forward. One of those connections with nuclear is space.
Yes.
So I have 2 questions about that. One is, what kind of impact do you think that this administration's deep interest in space and space exploration will have on your industry in terms of nuclear? Because that's necessary to go as far as we want to go into space to propel our exploration. And do you have, and your company have, any considerations of going away from terrestrial and from Earth to space as well?
Yeah. Phenomenal question. I'm a massive space buff. For Christmas, my family likes to buy me Apollo era trinkets, things on people's desks in the Apollo project. I want to go to Mars, and I actually think that Valar will have the first nuclear reactors on Mars. And the reason for that is I think that the nuclear technology, which gets perfected in modular form on Earth, is going to be the obvious one to put in a Starship Bay and put on Mars. And I know that nuclear is going to be necessary on Mars because it's just a mass question. It's you can't, if you could take 1,000 times less solar panels are actually bigger than nuclear reactors. People don't realize this. What's bigger, a nuclear reactor or a solar panel? The answer is a solar panel. The reason is because you need about 1,500 times more physical mass per power output than a nuclear reactor. And so, yeah, absolutely. Reactors will be used on Mars. Now, the interesting thing is what they'll be used for, right? So, yeah, you need to power the HAB, and you need some AC and pressure and whatever. The biggest thing that nuclear reactors, or that energy in general, will be used for on Mars is generating fuel, right? So when a Starship lands on the surface of Mars, it needs to be refueled in order to come back. The average, a starship will need about 200 tons of liquid methane to return to Earth. And 200 tons of liquid methane, I think is about 27 gigawatt hours of energy, which would take this like enormous solar field to generate, or about 3 of our Valar reactors. And what's really interesting, I gave a talk in Dallas about this a few weeks ago at a nuclear space conference, but I asked the audience, like, okay, let's say you wanted to send in the Starship all of the energy it needed to come back, right? So you have a Starship that's launching from Earth, it's gonna land there, generate its own fuel to come back. How much uranium would you need to send it with in order to come back? And I wish I had it with me today, but I actually have a block, a 3D printed cube. It's about this big. A little cube of uranium about this big is all the energy needed to send with the Starship to generate its own fuel to come back to Earth again. So there you go.
Last but not least, Mr. Talbot.
Isaiah, our grandson, 10 years ago, when he was in high school, taught himself how to take a computer apart, reprogram it, and put it back together again. We helped with his education. One day he called us on the phone and said, Grandpa, there is a chip that nobody can replicate. Its name is NVIDIA. How do we do? Okay, fast forward and you see, I'm asking you, I think you're perhaps at a comparable position that NVIDIA was in a decade ago. How do we invest in you? How do we ride with you in your project?
I really appreciate that. I look up to Jensen in many ways. Hope to work with them in the data center front. But we have an SPV that we're running as well for smaller amounts if people are interested. And so come and talk to me after.
So Isaiah's going to be here for a few minutes, but just to wrap, this is an example of the type of presents, okay? So I think back of when Palmer and I had a conversation in 2022, right? Blake Resnick. All these amazing stories and thought leaders and industry shapers, we do our best to engage you with them and vice versa. I'd also just want to comment on a couple of things that happened today. So we had lunch over at Bistro, and Isaiah and I are talking, and then all of a sudden, Elon retweets him, and then his phone just goes, talk about nuclear energy, okay? I thought that was awesome, and I'm in marketing, okay? So I'm always thinking about what's the genius marketing strategy of Valar Atomics? So we're sitting in this amazing room at Mar-a-Lago, President of the United States, David Sa, and then you have one guy that's wearing a suit, but he's got one thing different that everyone else doesn't have. Do you want to say what your secret of marketing is?
Actually, I can't take credit for it. Max came up with this strategy, but we brought some custom "Make Nuclear Great Again" hats to Mar-a-Lago, in the dark MAGA, dark hat with the light text, with the Valor logo on the side. And by the end of the night, I wasn't the only one wearing one of those hats. We brought extras, and we had many in the room wearing "Make Nuclear Great Again" hats. And I've heard that they've continued to be seen around Mar-a-Lago. So
take a little bit of that.